Thank you to Joe and the team for inviting me to present to you today on one of the innovations that we've developed, which is a low-cost airway clearance device for people with chronic lung disease. So today I'll briefly talk about my background and some of the work I've done in the past, which led up until this point. And then I'll talk to you about the device itself and our development process and who it's going to help. So a little bit about me. I am a physical therapist by background. I trained in Perth in Western Australia, which you can see here. It's a relatively small city compared to New York. And I worked at a large acute inpatient hospital in Perth, and my expertise is in pulmonary. And for most of my career in PT, I worked with adults with cystic fibrosis. So this is where I gained my skills in airway clearance techniques, which help patients to clear excess mucus from their lungs and reduce infection. And mid-2020, I moved over to New York, so mid-pandemic, and joined Mount Sinai. I had done undergraduate PT in Australia with David Petrino many years ago. And after completing my PhD, which was in modern technology in cystic fibrosis, I moved over to join his team at the Abilities Research Center. So airway clearance techniques, as I said, in its simplest form, help patients to clear their lungs. It's known to have many short and long-term benefits. So the shorter term benefits are less chest congestion, less coughing, more ability to do active things such as sport, not be interrupted at work and so on. And then long-term positive effects, including reducing infection and exacerbation frequency and improving quality of life. And this timeline just illustrates how airway clearance techniques have evolved over time. We don't need to discuss them all at length, but essentially it's moved from very relatively primitive techniques, which is your, chest wall percussion, and moving into techniques that focus on breathing and shifting mucus from within the airways rather than trying to physically percuss it out of someone, and then in more modern days using different devices to help oscillate the airways and manipulate the airflow in that way. And in many parts of the world, people don't use conventional chest PT anymore or percussion. We didn't use it for the last 10 or 15 years that I worked at the hospital in Perth. And I know that it can be quite common in some centers, but I firmly believe that it is more of a detrimental technique than beneficial. And I've been very fortunate to train with some very experienced people who've created the airway clearance techniques. So this includes in Sweden, in Belgium, throughout the UK and parts of Australia. And the good thing about airway clearance and PT for people with chronic lung diseases in Australia and England and Europe is that we offer a lot of different techniques to patients. We don't use the vest, which is another common device here, because we don't believe external forces on the chest wall work as well as teaching a patient how to breathe in a certain way or use a device to modify the airflow from within the airways. So as I said, we've moved from what was called postural drainage and percussion through to using devices such as the top one's called an Acapella. When you breathe into that device, it generates a small amount of resistance or back pressure to help splint open the airways. And then it also has a lever that oscillates, so it gently vibrates the airways from within. And then the picture at the bottom is what's called a PEP device, specifically a PEP mask. And that allows the patient to do cycles of breathing and build up their functional residual capacity to get air and pressure behind mucus and make coughing more effective. This is a video that I hope will come through okay on the recording, and it just shows a patient using one of these devices combined with inhaled hypertonic saline. So the aim of what we set out to do was to provide affordable airway clearance devices to patients with chronic lung disease and respiratory infections internationally. And I'll get to the point about why I mention affordable in this statement. So in terms of chronic lung disease in the United States, there's around 15 million people with COPD. A lot of people with COPD don't need to do airway clearance, but some do have elements of bronchiectasis in their airways. So they should. There's around 500,000 people with bronchiectasis and 30,000 with cystic fibrosis in the US. And then you can see worldwide, these numbers are far greater. So there's a huge market for people that need to do airway clearance techniques to clear the mucus in their airways. And why is this important? Because if you produce excessive airway secretions or mucus, it is a great area for bacteria to get in and colonize and cause repeated infection, which causes inflammation and airway scarring. And then over time, you have a loss of lung function, which ultimately results in reduced survival. So daily airway clearance techniques are required to be performed in people with excessive airway mucus. And that's where the breathing techniques and the different devices that we often call PEP or oscillating PEP devices come into it. And devices are often sold to hospitals and patients by medical device companies. And obviously anything that's sold by a company in the industry has a heavily inflated price. So these devices are relatively expensive, and a lot of smaller hospitals and patients cannot afford to purchase them. Many disease groups like CF rely on charity groups or foundations to purchase the devices for them, or in the US, insurance can pay for some of them. The devices need to be replaced regularly because they just deteriorate over time and patients often lose them. So we really need a simpler and cheaper option. And this is already an issue in developed countries. And so the problem in many third world countries is they cannot afford these devices at all. So you can see down the bottom, the prices range from minimum of around $40 right through to $200 for these devices. Another part of this story is that I've been to Brazil a few times to work with the University of Sao Paulo and the physical therapists there. And I've been to teach 2-day workshops. So this is teaching Brazilian PTs who also are academics and teach PT students all across the country. So people flew in for these workshops. And the reason we did this was that their curriculum was slightly outdated and they wanted to be provided with a more modern approach to doing airway clearance techniques. So we did a lot of theory. We had patients come in and practice them. And then the idea is that they would go back to their own universities and their own hospital clinics and start to teach PT students and the patients the more modern techniques that we were teaching at the course. And then this is an example of a patient in Brazil. So this young lady was in her early 20s. She had severe lung disease, severe liver disease. She should have been listed for transplant, but she hadn't been referred at that point, and she'd never been taught how to do modern airway clearance techniques or use an airway clearance device. So I had actually taken around 40 or 50 devices with me to Brazil. And so I was teaching her how to use an Acapella device. And this is a very common theme in countries like Brazil, other parts of South and Central America, some Eastern European countries, and then some Asian countries that the hospitals and the patients just can't access these devices purely because of cost. So we came up with a very simple, novel, but cheap solution. And I made some sketches and I got someone online to make me an AutoCAD drawing, an STL file. And then the idea was initially that we would start 3D printing these devices for people to use. But one of the issues with 3D printing is that it takes quite a while, and there's often inconsistencies in the finished product. So it would take forever to print thousands of these devices, and they all wouldn't come out the same. So we got put in touch with a manufacturer in Kentucky by the biodesign team at Mount Sinai. And these guys are amazing at what they do. They manufacture everything from very simple plastics through to aeronautical equipment. And so we gave them our concept for the device, and then they worked through their process and the injection molding and what they thought would be a better design. And they took what we did and made it definitely a lot better. And then we went down there and went through the whole process in the factory, looking at how they make it, how they determine whether it will handle the heat stress of the molding and so on. And so this was a great experience for us. And they ran the whole line, manufacturing line for us when we were there. So we got to see these things being made in real time. And here's just a quick video of one coming off the molding line, or two of them. So they could produce 3 or 4 sets of 2 devices every minute, which is just amazing. I'll just play that once more. And the other thing we're doing is to accompany this is making short videos, demonstration videos of how to do the technique. We have a patient. These are designed to be very simple. We're going to get them translated into a number of different languages. And then when the devices are packaged, they'll contain a slip with QR codes for English, Portuguese, Spanish, whatever other language we need to put on it. And so the PTs and the patients in whatever country these end up in can just scan the QR code and go through the instructional video, and then the patients can continue to use that as a guide at home. So the idea behind this is to keep it less sophisticated, low cost. We're not charging the PTs and patients in these other countries for the devices. And so the difference with our process is that the IP, or the patent for the original PEP devices, has ended. So we're not infringing on anyone's IP, but at the same time, there's not a lot of IP for us to protect in what we're doing. But we're okay with that because we just want to get these devices into patients' hands as soon as possible and not get held up with all of that red tape. And currently, we have an ethics proposal that's very near to being approved in Brazil. So we'll be starting a study there to get patient feedback. We're also running pressure and flow studies at Mount Sinai in parallel to that, in conjunction with people in anesthesiology. And then through our connections, we're after Brazil, we're going to be going to Argentina, Honduras, Costa Rica, Colombia, some of these different countries where we've got connections with rehab physicians and PTs. And we'll hopefully be going down there to run workshops similar to what we've done in Brazil. But if we can't, we'll still be sending the devices down there and doing some of this work remotely, and then hopefully getting these devices into patients' hands as soon as possible. They're clearly not as sophisticated as the devices on the market, so we're not going to claim that they will work as good. But knowing the principles behind airway clearance techniques, we know that they will work good enough. And the more important thing is that these patients have an option to use a device like this as opposed to nothing. So 2022 will be a very exciting year for us in terms of getting these devices out. We've already had 3,500 devices made. And as I said, we'll be distributing them at no cost throughout these countries to the PTs and patients. So Thank you for coming along and listening, and I'll be happy to take your questions in the session now.